Protests have erupted across Georgia, with thousands of people taking to the streets to express their anger and frustration over what they perceive as growing Russian interference in their country's politics. The unrest stems from the recent parliamentary election, held just over a month ago, which saw the pro-Russian Georgian Dream Party narrowly securing a majority under highly suspicious circumstances. The election, marred by allegations of voter fraud and coercion, has been widely criticized by both domestic and international observers. However, it was not just the election itself that ignited public outrage. Shortly after their victory, the Georgian Dream government made a deeply unpopular announcement: they would suspend negotiations on Georgia's EU accession for 4 years. This decision shattered the hopes of many Georgians who have long sought closer ties with Europe and a break from Russia's sphere of influence. The protests have steadily grown in size and intensity, drawing people from all walks of life: students, professionals, opposition politicians, and ordinary citizens who are united in their frustration with the government. What began as scattered demonstrations has evolved into a nationwide movement, with protests now spreading to cities like Batumi and Kutaisi. Many view the suspension of EU talks as a direct betrayal of Georgia's pro-European aspirations, which have been central to the country's political identity since it gained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. For these protesters, the government's actions represent not just a step backward but a full surrender to Russian influence, something that the Georgian people, with their long history of resistance against Moscow's domination, are unwilling to accept. The election itself, which set this chain of events in motion, has been widely criticized for its lack of transparency and fairness. Videos have surfaced showing blatant instances of fraud, including ballot stuffing by Georgian Dream officials and cash being handed out at polling stations to influence voters. Perhaps most troubling were the reports of voter intimidation. In many cases, government employees and other vulnerable groups were pressured to vote for Georgian Dream. Some workers were even summoned to their bosses' offices and told that their votes would be monitored. Cameras installed at polling stations, ostensibly to prevent fraud, were strategically positioned to compromise the secrecy of the ballot, further intimidating voters. While Georgian Dream technically won the election by a slim margin of just 3%, many argue that this victory was neither free nor fair. The widespread perception of election fraud has only deepened the public's mistrust of the government. The announcement to pause EU accession talks served as the final straw for many Georgians. Joining the European Union has long been a national goal, representing a path toward democracy, prosperity, and independence from Russian influence. The government's decision to halt this process not only dashed those hopes but also signaled a troubling alignment with Moscow. Critics have pointed out that while Georgian Dream claims to support EU integration, its actions consistently tell a different story. This pattern of behavior has led many to conclude that the party is serving Russian interests, further eroding Georgia's sovereignty and democratic aspirations. The ongoing protests have drawn comparisons to Ukraine's 2014 Maidan Revolution, where widespread anger over Russian influence and government corruption ultimately led to the collapse of the pro-Russian regime. In Georgia, too, the protests are seen as a broader struggle for national identity and independence. The parallels are striking. Both countries share a history of conflict with Russia. Both have faced Russian invasions and territorial occupations, and both have sought to align themselves with the West, despite Moscow's fierce opposition. For many Georgians, the current protests are not just about the election or the EU talks, they are about the future of their country and its place in the world. Georgia's geopolitical situation is uniquely challenging. The country's modern history has been shaped by struggle to assert its independence in the face of Russian aggression. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, occupying 20% of its territory, including the regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These areas remain under Russian control to this day, serving as a constant reminder of Moscow's determination to dominate its neighbors. For Russia, former Soviet states like Georgia represent critical components of its so-called sphere of influence. Moscow has consistently opposed any moves by these countries to join the EU or NATO, viewing such alignments as direct threats to its regional control. The stakes for Russia are particularly high. Allowing neighboring countries like Georgia to prosper under Western influence would expose the deep flaws in Russia's own political and economic system. Over the past 3 decades, countries like Poland and the Baltic states have thrived after joining the EU, achieving levels of economic growth and quality of life and are far beyond what Russia has managed to deliver for its own citizens. For example, Poland, which had a GDP per capita roughly half that of Russia in 1991, now boasts a GDP per capita nearly double that of Russia. These success stories present a stark contrast to Russia's stagnating economy, which remains plagued by corruption, inequality, and the effects of international sanctions. This economic disparity poses a serious threat to the Kremlin, as ordinary Russians face rising food prices, a collapsing ruble, and limited opportunities. They cannot help but notice the success of their neighbors. The Kremlin fears that such prosperity could inspire dissent within its own borders, making it all the more determined to prevent countries like Georgia from fully embracing Western integration. This insecurity has driven Moscow to maintain its grip on Georgia through a combination of political influence, military presence, and economic pressure. The protests in Georgia have put the government in a precarious position. Billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili, the de facto leader of Georgian Dream, has long been criticized for his ties to Russia. Much of his wealth was accumulated in Russia, and his close relationship with Moscow has raised questions about where his loyalties lie. As the protests continued to escalate, Ivanishvili and other members of the government faced mounting pressure, both domestically and internationally. Some Georgian officials have already been sanctioned by Western powers, and the country's currency has depreciated amid the political turmoil. The parallels to Ukraine's Maidan revolution grow stronger each day. In Ukraine, public outrage over Russian influence and government corruption eventually forced President Viktor Yanukovych to flee the country. The Georgian government now faces a similar dilemma. If it resorts to violence to suppress the protests, it risks further inflaming public anger and escalating the situation. On the other hand, if it refuses to address the protesters' demands, it risks losing legitimacy and control. For now, the protests remain largely peaceful, but the atmosphere is tense. Night after night, the streets of Tbilisi are filled with fireworks, tear gas, and the chants of thousands demanding change. The struggle unfolding in Georgia is emblematic of a larger geopolitical battle between Russia and the West. Moscow's aggressive foreign policy, rooted in both insecurity and a desire for control, aims to prevent former Soviet states from aligning with the EU and NATO. Historically, Moscow has viewed these countries as buffers against potential threats. In the modern era, however, this has translated into efforts to suppress their democratic aspirations and maintain their dependence on Russia. For the people of Georgia, this fight is about much more than EU membership. It is about reclaiming their country's independence and ensuring a better future for generations to come. As the protests continue to grow, the future of Georgia hangs in the balance. Will the government bow to public pressure and hold new elections, or will it double down on its pro-Russian stance? And what role will the international community play in supporting Georgia's democratic aspirations? One thing is certain: the people of Georgia are determined to fight for their country's sovereignty, even in the face of immense challenges. The coming weeks will be critical in determining the outcome of this struggle, not only for Georgia, but for the broader region as well.